That's what I want.
That's the robot lady. There we go.
Great. We are now recording the meeting. Let me share my screen. And everybody can see the slides. That's all working. Great. I now have my participants and chat window list up here. So great. Thank you everyone for joining our annual W3C TPAC Music Notation Community Group meeting. This is another of our, we meet annually. We have for many years now, and this is our, I guess, third online version of the meeting, our second that is co-located with the, virtually anyway, with the TPAC meeting, the W3C's annual technical meeting. So let me go to the agenda. Since we have new people here from the W3C, I'll be giving some of an introduction to the Music Notation Community Group, describing what the group is, what we've been working on both recently and in the past few years. And then we will move on to the bulk of the meeting in terms of project status and community group leadership changes. So we will give updates on our 4 projects, MNX, Smoofle, the instrument database, and Music XML, then discuss my upcoming retirement and leadership changes that involves with the community group, and have time for questions and answers. We should have plenty of time to cover this agenda, so if you have questions, just unmute yourselves and ask the questions. We also have a fairly small group this time, so that should work out fine. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording and the transcript and everything will be shared on YouTube as and via our blog, as it usually has been over the past few years. So with that, let me get to our introduction. The W3C Music Notation Community Group was founded 7 years ago, July 2015. Joe Berkovitz, at the time Hal Leonard and Noteflight, was instrumental in getting the group started, transferring work that had been done in the past on standards such as Music XML and Smoofle that were housed at individual companies, and bringing them to the vendor neutral association of the W3C, which has been very good for both of these standards, I think. We develop and maintain format and language specifications for notated music in web, mobile, and desktop applications. So there are literally hundreds of applications out there that use our standards from the community group. We both maintain and update the Music XML and standard music font layout specifications. Music XML is a specification that lets notation apps exchange data between themselves. Smoofle is the specification that lets music fonts be interchangeable using the Unicode private use area. It used to be that music fonts didn't use Unicode at all, and they were not interchangeable. It was a very Wild Westy type of situation, and now things are much more standardized. With the success of those standards, of course, a common theme through TPAC is that once you succeed in one standard, that brings up new use cases, more things that people want to do. Same thing has happened with music notation. There's a lot of demand for, can we have a standard format for interactivity, a standard format that we can use as a native representation format for notation, especially for web-based applications. And so we have the new MNX project and specification that is designed to handle these new use cases that Music XML doesn't handle very well, or in some cases was explicitly designed not to handle. That it was a counter goal to support those in Music XML, but now it becomes more important, and we want a new specification to handle those. We are now the 8th largest W3C community group. That's the same ranking as last year. Last year we were like in the top 5 or something in terms of activity, because we got both new versions of both Music XML and the Smoofle spec out. This year we're down to the top 10% because we're not quite as active this year, but still quite an active group with many ongoing specifications. And there is our URL to get more information about the group. A little more detail on the standards. I mentioned some of this earlier, but Music XML is supported now by over 260 different applications. These include all the major notation editors, digital audio workstations, music scanning, music practice, music analysis, and some of my favorite new applications that have come out. Singing synthesis in Japan especially is very music XML is very popular for moving between different singing synthesis applications. And over the past year, there's a gentleman who developed a music XML importer and exporter for the Houdini 3D graphics animation procedural graphics package. So you can bring in a music XML score, visualize it in 3D graphics, edit the 3D graphics representation, and then export it back out as music XML. So it's not just for notation editors and digital audio workstations anymore. Smoofle, meanwhile, is supported by most of the major notation editors, including the ones that you see there. Also supported by several other important music notation programs. Most of the time when you see a new music notation fonts being released these days, these are Smoofle fonts. There's not a lot of demand now for the older legacy fonts. And with both of these specifications, we released new releases last year in 2021, which we covered at last year's meeting. And this is eye chart this is the last time you'll see this eye chart, most likely. Of all the different music XML applications. When you get the slides, you'll be able to expand this out to something that's more readable than it may be on your screen now. But there are lots and lots of different applications, the ones that read and write music XML, the ones that are just writing, and the ones that are just reading, and divided into the ones that are shipping and the prototypes. So just to get a visual sense of the scope of the standards that we do at this group. And with that, we'll move on to our project updates. And that's Adrian for MNX. Any
Hello,
questions?
everybody.
I'm sorry, any questions on the introduction before we move over to MNX? And also, if you want to have any questions in chat, that's also good. But there aren't any, so on to Adrian for MNX.
Okay, so I'm going to give an update on what we've accomplished in the MNX specification over the last, since the last meeting. And for those of you who are new to MNX, this is a still in progress specification that we're working on. There's no software that actually uses it yet. It's being actively designed. And there's a lot has been done, but there's still a lot to do. And here's some of the highlights of what we've done recently that personally I think is some of the most interesting stuff that really demonstrates the power of the new MNX approach. So the first thing I wanted to show is what's on this slide here, which is something called layouts. What can you go back to?
I don't know what happened. Oh, I sorry.
So this is 3 separate visual scores that are 3 different graphical representations of the same music, a 4-part choral piece, obviously. The interesting thing here with this new feature is that a single MNX document can encode all 3 things here in one place. So the way this works is you encode the bones of your music, so the measures, the notes, their pitches, the rhythms, and then you can create 1 or more what are called scores within the MNX document. And a score in MNX terminology is a visual representation, or it doesn't necessarily need to be visual. It's hard to explain this without getting super semantic, but it's basically an instantiation of the music for some sort of consumption, if that wasn't too abstract. So these 3 visual scores here are all represented in a different score element in the MNX document. And what you can see if you look closely is the notation is actually munged together in interesting ways. So in the first one, you just have every part on its own staff, but you can also use the layout system in MNX to pick and choose from multiple parts and combine them on the same staff. and then specify the stem direction in case of multi-voice staves, or specify that you want them to be stemmed together as chords. So the idea is you have your sort of semantic definition of the music, and then you have the presentational bits, which are the scores. And yeah, that's these things are called layouts. Each score can have multiple layouts, and in fact, every system can have a different layout, and it's quite powerful. There was a lot of back and forth about different various use cases that needed to be done, that needed to be possible, and we sort of bent over backwards to get this stuff possible in a non too verbose way. So that's layouts. If we could, let's go to the next slide. Second major effort has been styles, which is an infrastructure for applying certain styles to a subset of your notation. The first one that we implemented was color, which we picked for simplicity, but this would also apply to things like smaller note heads, maybe some sort of audio decision, like whether the note is muted or not, and maybe stem directions and things like that. Areas where you want to make a decision about a subset of your music. So we were heavily inspired by style sheets here. And the way that this works is you can have two ways of styling things. The first one is to make basically a global rule as a style rule, and that's what's communicated here. In this little bit of MNX code, you can see the style element with two attributes. The selector tells the document what sort of things you're selecting, and that is the note element. And then the remaining attributes are whatever styles you want to apply. So in an English sentence, this means for every note in the document, color it blue. And in case you're not familiar with that color code, that's a standard hex code value that's very common in web development. So if we go to the next slide, another thing that you might want to do is only style certain elements of the document. And you could, so the music XML way of doing this would be in every individual note, you would put the color blue. But in MNX here, we've introduced a small layer of abstraction so that you can create a class, which is, in this case, something called emphasized, which we just made up. You can put whatever you want there. And then you can give your notes or any notational elements that class, and that basically gives you a way of targeting that stuff. So in your notation markup in the MNX file, you would have the class equals emphasized for whatever notes that you consider emphasized according to whatever meaning you give that for your own application. And then in your style section of the document, you can say, for anything that has the class emphasized, it gets this color, which, and having this abstraction is very powerful because then you can, if you decide to change the color, you change it in literally one place, and then everything that has that class gets it changed automatically. Now, these styles can be global to your document, and they can also be limited to one of the scores. So back a couple slides ago, you saw 3 different scores in the same document. So each one of those scores can have its own distinct styles, which it's very powerful and flexible. So we started with colors because, like I said, they were simple, but now that we have the infrastructure for this designed and implemented in the spec, it should be pretty easy to add other stylable things. Should we go on to the next one? Another one of the big architectural things that we wanted to work out sooner rather than later is how to reconcile the differences between scores and parts. In Music XML, latest version of Music XML, you can now combine a score and a part in the same Music XML document, but they're two separate documents in the same file. And we were with MNX hoping to have our cake and eat it too, such that you only need to encode the music once. And then from that, the orchestral score, the conductor's score, and the individual parts can be derived. So having everything in one place has a lot of benefits, as you can imagine. So the first foray into this was our recent work on multi-measure rests. And the way this works is, see here you have three scores that are all encoded in a single MNX document. You have the full score up above, and then you have the individual parts for the individual highly talented musicians who to be able to play this stuff. So the idea is every one of the scores defines its own multi-measure rests such that it's totally isolated to the score. So for that part A, the decision of where to put that multi-measure rest is solely in sort of what we consider the right place, which is that score, that visual instantiation of the document. And this thing, it feels pretty good, and I think it'll be a good model for subsequent notations that need to differ between instantiations, differences between scores and parts. The next thing on our to-do list is to do this for note spelling, for enharmonic differences between a score and a part. And so, yeah, that is in active development, where we should have proposals coming up very, very soon. Should we go to the next one? There's some, oh, should we pause for Jim's question? I just saw, Jim says, I have a use case for encode once derived menu as a choral rehearsal score, which could selectively emphasize one voice part and de-emphasize the others. I recall being told that styles was not the way to achieve it. Do scores provide the way to achieve it? Yes, exactly. That would be achieved with our layouts. Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by emphasize. If you want those de-emphasized notes to remain, you would use styles. And if you want, sorry, go ahead.
A typical approach in choral music is to, create playback where one part is louder than the other parts. So Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, if he also wants some visual cue, but in that use case, I think playback is the most likely difference. And I still think, right, that styles could be.
Yeah, you could.
The layouts rather can be.
Yeah, layouts would do it, and styles. If you wanted to do the audio thing, we haven't implemented any sort of volume encoding, but yeah, that it would be a combination of layouts and styles.
This is Jim. The emphasis I had in mind was actually legible, visible emphasis. So one part gets its own staff, the other parts get combined onto a staff, have smaller notes, that sort of thing. So that someone reading the score sees their part clearly, but sees the other parts for context. Playback is also another good case. And what I'm thinking of is the idea of a digital score, which can do a whole lot more than a printed score and enables use cases that are not possible with printed scores. And I'm just trying to make sure MNX does not preemptively wall off possibilities.
Yeah, that's one of the core use cases of MNX, what you just described.
Okay, great.
In general. So yeah,
But
you would be able to do that with our.
What I want to look for to do that is, it sounds like.
Sorry, I was speaking over you.
I'm sorry, I was speaking over you. Layouts is the buzzword that I want in order to accomplish that.
Exactly. And the best way to dive into that is to go to our examples page, and which is just in our documentation. It's a list of dozens of examples where you have a screenshot of the notation, and then you have the MNX code that was used to encode it. And in many cases, there's a little paragraph saying, sort of explaining what's happening. And there's several for layouts. If you just search the page for layouts, you'll find a couple.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Jim.
So other stuff that's happened in the MNX world is we've moved to a new documentation system. We used to have the one big HTML page using this standard, basically a markdown document that was then munged by some code, and it was a bit unwieldy, and I wanted to make it more hyperlinked and example focused system for the docs. So that was a big-ish effort over the last little while, and we're now totally moved over to that. And yeah, there's some little things which are, yeah, pretty obscure. We've made a couple of backwards incompatible changes. The last one on the list there, I'll talk about first, which was we were using elements called measure and direction in multiple contexts, and that's actually not a good thing to do for various technical reasons and also human reasons, because it's confusing. So now we have measure dash global and measure on its own. And then we also improved some stuff about directions, such as jumps. And it had been unclear where visually the direction should be attached. So we cleaned that up, like I said, minutia. We go to the next one. So the next steps would be finalize the list of V1 features. So we've been sort of doing the big stuff that we know will be really hairy and messy to figure out, like this layout stuff and the difference between scores and parts. Whereas a lot of music notation is simple Boolean values. Does this notehead have a staccato marking? How many tremolo marks are on this stem? That stuff will be very, very easy to do. We've been working on the really hairy stuff. So yeah, more broadly, next steps will be finalize the list of version 1 features and then just implement all of them one by one. And we've been trying to do an example first approach where we always start with the screenshot of actual notation to keep it as practical as possible. And there's something called the MNX converter, which is an open source Python library that we've developed that will take music XML and turn it into MNX so that you can hopefully start getting some intuition for how the format feels. And down the road, I envision this becoming a bit of a Swiss Army knife, so we'll be able to convert both ways, and hopefully will help bootstrap notation applications to import and export MNX by simply using this open source library. So that will continue to be developed. Let's move on. And of course, you should all get involved because it's a pretty small group of people that are working on this. So I would love to get more contributors. We're using GitHub for issue tracking, as with the other music notation community group projects. I would love to get more people's opinions on things. Even if you read something and you just think, okay, sounds fine, say that, because it will help get some feeling that we're getting that you know the ideas are good. And definitely, I don't know how many people in this need to know this, but follow our blog where we post the minutes of the co-chair meetings every 2 weeks, and the mailing list where we occasionally make announcements, and there's various questions. Most of the conversation happens on GitHub though. And yeah, that's it for MNX. Any questions on MNX? That's it. All right.
Left them speechless.
We'll have a question session at the end too, if anything else comes up. All right, take it away, Daniel.
Looks good to me. And now, yes, let's move on to Daniel for a Smoofle update.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so as Michael said earlier on, Smoofle 1.4 was released in March of last year, and since then we've been collecting issues in GitHub for a possible, well, it was always going to be a 1.5, but what is now becoming firmed up as 1.5. In fact, I think we're probably more or less there in terms of collecting the issues that we will probably work on for 1.5. It won't really be about adding new symbols, though we will add some new symbols in the new version. There have been a number of good suggestions, and in fact, one quite interesting sort of live issue right now is about potentially adding ranges of symbols that are used in Chinese notation when they're written using Western music notation, which is an interesting area. And if we do go down that road, there'll be quite a lot of new symbols coming from there, but we'll see how that goes. But really the focus of Smoofle 1.5 is going to be about the metadata files. So Smoofle has two sets of metadata files. There is the Smoofle metadata itself, which describes the glyphs, the ranges that they're arranged into, their code points. It provides things like a human readable name, both for each glyph and for each range of glyphs, and so on and so forth. So those are reasonably uncontroversial, the Smoofle specific ones, although we will talk a little bit in a minute about some changes we want to make there for 1.5. But probably the more interesting kind of metadata file is the one that talks about the specific capabilities of individual fonts, and that's what we call the font specific metadata file, and that provides information about things like the so-called engraving defaults. So for example, how line thickness is and these sorts of things ought to be set in order to harmonize with the design of the font. Recently in 1.4 we also added things like specifying what text font should be partnered with it and so on. And generally speaking, what the metadata seeks to do is provide a repository of data that a consuming application can use to work out what to do with the font. So for example, it will say some applications need to know things like the bounding boxes of the glyphs if they can't work them out for themselves, for example, depending what APIs they're using. Smoofle defines things like cutouts or anchors, which are either rectangles or points that are relative to the glyph's origin that you can use for positioning and for collision avoidance and these sorts of things. One of the things that Smoofle provides, but doesn't necessarily have particularly rich metadata about so far, is the ability to have what we call optional glyphs. So we have both recommended glyphs, which live in the main private use area, or the beginning of the private use area in the basic multilingual plane. But we've carved out a set of about, can't remember how many it is, I think it's 512 symbols at the end of that range that each font can put in their own optional glyphs for their own purposes, whatever they might be. So if you like a sort of private use, and some of those, for example, in Bravura, which is the reference font for Smoofle, we have things like optical variants, so glyphs that are the same size physically, but are designed to be drawn at a different size. So for example, you might have a small version of a clef or something that looks a bit fat when you see it the same size as the normal clef, but when you scale it down to 2/3 the normal size, it visually looks about right compared to the full size clef and this sort of thing. But there isn't a good way at the moment to semantically describe in the metadata files what those optional glyphs are for. So one of the main things we want to improve is the richness of the information about those optional glyphs. So we'll probably end up with some sort of enumeration or whatever that describes the purpose of each glyph, as well as so that the application can know not only what glyph it is meant to replace or be an alternative for, but also why that particular glyph is there, so that applications that want to look for, optional variants or straight flags rather than curvy flags, or French things rather than other European things, or whatever it might be, they will be able to then find the information in the metadata file about what those glyphs actually are. So that is the main goal, but as the final bullet point on the slide says, we're also going to change the way that fonts for text-based applications work. So Smoofle actually defines two major sort of broad use cases for the fonts that might use the SMOOFL standard. One is for, music notation applications, typically things like Dorico and MuseScore and Finale and so on. But it also defines for text-based applications, i.e. when you want to put musical symbols in line with normal, so-called normal text from a regular text font. And when we first specified SMOOFL nearly 10 years ago now, one of the use cases that was identified as being very important was to be able to basically do simple music layout within a text-based application using the font on its own. There are a number of fonts that have been around over the years that do this. The most famous one is called Bach, the musicological font. And it was decided early on in SMOOFL's life that we should target the same set of use cases with a kind of font for text-based applications. I think, in fact, over the last decade, it's proven to be the case that with the increasing accessibility to a wide range of ways of producing music notation symbolically, whether it's using, libraries like VexFlow or Verovio, or embeddable things like SoundSlice or cloud publishing, or all these sorts of different things, that is actually, there's much less need for that complex set of use cases these days, and that what's really needed is something much simpler, which is just the ability to insert any of the symbols that are categorized and present in a SMOOFL font into text, for the purposes of showing a symbol for a legend or for an academic paper or whatever it might be. And so the plan is that we will simplify the specification of fonts for text-based applications in SMOOFL 1.5. We'll effectively retire the current, I'm not aware of any other font apart from Bravura Text, the reference font, that has ever implemented these specifications. So we'll effectively retire that old version of Bravura Text as so that anybody who wants to use it has still got it available with all of its fancy ligatures and glyph positioning features to make notes move up and down and this kind of thing. And we'll instead migrate Bravura Text and the recommendations in the specification towards simply having all the symbols registered appropriately for layout in a run of text and scaled appropriately for layout in a run of text. So those are the two biggest changes that we're planning to the specification, and yeah, hopefully they will turn out to be all right. Can we move on to the next? Oh, there's a question from Jim about Unicode 15. So yeah, Unicode releases are always interesting. They're mostly emojis, of course, these days, since I think that seems to be the most rapidly expanding area of human communication that is written rather than any actual real languages. But no, it doesn't really affect SMOOFL because we confine all of SMOOFL's glyphs to the private use area in the basic multilingual plane. That range is earmarked, it's never going to change, and so our glyphs can happily live in there. We have over the years talked about whether or not we should propose that some of the ranges of glyphs that we've identified in SMOOFL should actually be formally adopted by Unicode in new ranges. And that's not a dead issue, but we haven't. It's not something that we think that we need to do right now. The bar is relatively high to get these things into Unicode. The last music notation stuff that was added was nearly 25 years ago now. Perry Rowland was the sort of instigator behind the simple set of music notation symbols that were encoded, I think, in Unicode 8. That would have been, and the SMOOFL is a superset of those symbols, but by now 10 times as many symbols as were included in that. So it would be a big job if we wanted to propose that even some of SMOOFL symbols should be moved into Unicode proper, but we don't rule it out as something for the future. On the other hand, we also need to consider now that there is a decent body of software and fonts that are using the SMOOFL organization within the private use area, and so we would still need some kind of backwards compatibility solution to keep those things there as well for the purposes of the fonts that are already out there and the software that's already using it. So doesn't seem like a big priority right now. But yeah, that is certainly something we can keep an eye on as time marches on. So yes, how can you help with Smoofle 1.5? So one of the things, as I mentioned, the Smoofle metadata files, which contain the glyph names and the ranges of glyphs, which you can see in the specification if you go and look on the website. You see every glyph has its own canonical name, which is always in English and is in camel case. And we have an agreement that even if I idiotically made a spelling mistake in that name or completely mischaracterized a symbol, which has happened in a few cases, that has to stay there forever. But the human readable description, which is currently only in English, that is mutable. We can change that. And likewise, although the contents of the ranges in terms of their code points and the sort of general categorization is also fixed now, the names of the ranges could also be changed, and indeed they could usefully be translated into other languages. So for example, software applications that show the names of glyphs in Smoofle, or that show the names of the ranges, as some do, both Finale and Dorico do, for example, it would be helpful to be able to have those in other languages. So Transifex is a service that it's available for all sorts of projects, but they very kindly provide free project support for open source projects like Smoofle. And so we have got the Smoofle 1.4 versions of the ranges.json and the glyphnames.json files up there. And we would love to see some community translation effort going into them. We have had already, I think, 700 of the 3,000 strings in German translated, primarily, I think, by folks who have been contributing to MuseScore. And we're very grateful for those contributions that we've already had. But if you don't need to feel like, if you're interested in this, you don't need to feel like you need to sit down and translate all 12,000 words, but any translation or even any review of existing translation that has already been done by another contributor would be very warmly and gratefully received. So that is a link actually in this presentation. I guess the presentation will be shared, but we'll certainly share these links independently as well later on. And then beyond Transifex and the translation effort, then otherwise you're very welcome, and please do have a look at the milestone on the issue tracker on GitHub to see which issues are actually in there. We have a few issues at the moment, and I will try to use this label consistently whenever we are looking at particular things and seeking specific feedback. For some issues it's very simple, it's just a glyph that should be added. There's an obvious source or set of sources, it's obvious where it should go, it's obvious what it should be called, and so on. But there are some slightly beefier issues, including ones to do with exactly how, for example, the localized names that we're going to generate through Transifex should actually be then incorporated into the distribution of the eventual Smoofle 1.5. So have a look and let us know if there's anything there that makes sense. And of course, you are still welcome to add new issues at any time, but we, depending on what sort of size they are, they may or may not make their way into the milestone for the next version. I see that Jim's left one more question there. Open type variable font techniques. Well, so Smoofle tries to be font technology agnostic. The idea is, in practice, of course, nearly all fonts these days are open type fonts of one flavor or another. So it isn't completely divorced from the font technology, but it tries to be as simple and as abstract away from specific font technologies as possible. Really, the only requirement is that it should be able to be addressed by a particular Unicode code point. That's really the only sort of font technology specific requirement that there is for a Smoofle font. And we think that's important because we want to make the standard as widely applicable as possible. So that would mean, that it could be used in any kind of web application. It can be used directly in things like SVG. It can be used in desktop applications, and so on and so forth. Now, having said that, of course, so far, as far as I know, anyway, all of the fonts that implement the Smoofle standard have been open type fonts. But I don't think that the Smoofle specification itself needs to really have anything to say about variable font, widths and masters and these sorts of things. It might be that if, for example, somebody out there is creative enough to come up with a way of having a variable music notation font that does interesting things with, you know, widths or thicknesses or whatever it might be, then maybe the thing that we would want to do is provide a means in the font specific metadata file of, you know, identifying the parameters that can be changed, or providing, for example, particular fixed values that would give you, you know, narrow, wider, or thinner or thicker, or whatever it might be. But it's quite a, I mean, I'm by no means an experienced typographer beyond the work that I've done on Smoofle fonts. I know that, for example, Jeff, who's in the meeting, is a very experienced typographer and probably has given some thought to using these variable techniques with notation fonts. Jeff, I don't know whether you want to say anything about that, if you have a mic.
And the only thing I would say is that, you know, even if you do, you know, there's not much you need to do right now for variable font. Like you could implement a variable font for Smoofle fonts and that'd be fine. Problem is you don't have any applications that are taking advantage of it. And like the idea of storing, you know, defining various parameters, that's actually part of the variable font standard. So that would be in the tables. And so the application could pull that data out, and you could even set to say, hey, here's my predefined stuff. So that doesn't even need to be in the metadata. At least that, from what I'm thinking about, you could, if you support variable fonts, you could actually do it in a way, if the music software did, say, then you could do it in a way that it would just be there and it would know to choose things from there. And the part you would define is maybe saying, okay, here's predefined variables that we know about, but we could all, that we say we recommend you use, but otherwise you could, the software could pull it out directly. But yeah, I would agree with you that there's not much that needs to change in the standard other than maybe the recommendations that I just mentioned.
Yeah. Sadly, it would be, we, for example, in Dorico would not be able to make use of any of that because the APIs that we have access to simply don't know anything about them right now. But, you know, maybe one day that could be done.
Yeah, Qt.
Yeah, it's pretty good, but, you know.
I know, but their font support has always been not. Anyways, go on.
One day, when we have time to reinvent all the wheels, we'll do it all again from scratch.
They'll catch up eventually, maybe.
Oh, Philip's got his hand up. Go for it, Philip. We can't hear you yet. Try again.
How's this? Better?
Ah, perfect.
Thank you. Good to see everybody. Thank you, Daniel, for this, and Adrian before. I also wanted to take the opportunity just now to congratulate Michael on his retirement, and I know you'll be talking about that, Michael, but you're a legend. So with respect to the fonts, Daniel, you mentioned a couple things that got me thinking about using fonts in other applications, text-based fonts, and you were also talking about the the open type features. Chord symbols is something that has come up, and again, you mentioned you're not an experienced typographer. I'm not an experienced member of this group by any means. So, forgive me if this has already been discussed and discarded, but it occurred to me that chord symbols are really more like music notation, and the software applications to this point have treated them more like text, like a combination of like plain text fonts, alphanumeric text fonts and music notation fonts. They draw like the letters and the numbers from a text font, and then the flats and the sharps from the music font, and they try to put them together in all these various ways. And of course, Dorico has all these positioning rules. Finale, you have to create the different chord symbol. You have to get in the chord symbol editor. Sibelius does it a different way, as with the 6+ chord symbols, where there are actual fonts and you're limited to those fonts. And I was just wondering, is there any thought given to, creating a Smoofle spec that, it would have to account for all the various ways that people like to draw their chord symbols and that sort of thing, superscript, subscript, so on and so forth. But is there a way, is it possible to consider a way to use those open type features, having, you just said, being open type agnostic to a certain extent, but, using those ways of sophisticated kerning and leading and so on and so forth, so that a font designer, what I'm getting at is a font designer could, design as part of a Smoofle font, an entire series of chord symbols in the way that the font designer has explicitly want them to shown, and really fine tune those positioning and the proportions between the flat and the letter and so on and so forth, so that they would display the same way, whether, you were using Dorico, Finale, any Smoofle, or in a text. So if somebody wrote, A flat, add 9, and the designer had, done those ligatures in such a way that they displayed exactly how they wanted to, it would just display that way. And I've been talking with Nordine, he's created this set of Smoofle fonts, and he's very much keen on this sort of thing. He developed this whole crazy system of, typing in certain strings that display a chord symbol. To a certain extent, that's the way Sibelius works as well, but everybody has their own way of doing it. But, so it seemed like this might be ripe for something to be brought under a standard, such as, Smoofle and or Music XML, so that font designers could really run with this, and everybody could agree on how to implement these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge area, and I can speak from the experience of implementing at least 2 of the systems that you having intimate knowledge of the implementation of at least 2 of those systems that you've talked about there, Philip. I mean, the answer is we certainly could do something. I mean, the way that we've sort of tended to approach the Smoofle project to date is to really be the repository of the symbols that are needed. And while we do have simple guidelines for things like, for example, how note heads and stems should attach, or where clefs should be registered relative to the origin, so that a music notation application can simply splat it down in a particular point and it will then draw there. This is a whole other sort of level of complexity on top, because it's a sort of 3D. Well, is it 3D? I suppose it's 2D kerning, because you want to kern not only horizontally but also vertically, and you also want to scale, and a lot of these other adjustments. And as you say, these can all be achieved to every level of precision that's required by careful use of the glyph positioning features in OpenType. Whether or not that is something that Smoofle should try to have something to say about, I don't know. I mean, again, I suppose it means that the question is really, is there demand from the the people who are going to implement the standard for those sorts of things? Would the software vendors implement such a thing? Because it might, for example, involve changing the way that those existing features they already have in their applications for chord symbols. It might involve changing those in, maybe small or maybe quite big ways. And if, for example, it did rely on OpenType font features, then that also limits the applications that can actually use those things directly, because not every application will be able to make use of all of those. Even though glyph positioning features do tend to be the ones that are most widely used, it's not universal. However, for example, just to lift the curtain a bit on how Dorico works a little bit in this area, Dorico does have a kind of its own kerning data that we have done by looking at combinations of Bravura and other fonts, and then basically producing effectively symbol versus symbol kerning, rather than kerning that obviously within one font, where you've got the A and the B and the B and the C and the A and the C and the A and the, all this kind of stuff. Instead, it's a C and a flat and a C and a sharp and a C and a 6 and a C, and this kind of thing, so that we can hopefully, and so maybe what there could be would be some kind of metadata that could be used to describe the horizontal and vertical positioning that would be needed under certain conditions. But that it would have to be quite a complicated, because basically what we're doing effectively is saying, let's abstract the things that you would put into those glyph positioning tables and abstract them out into some other kind of format that could be conceived by anything that is able to draw a glyph and then draw another glyph relative to it at a particular size. So for example, you might be able to generate the glyph positioning tables for the font, for the OpenType font from that data. And you might also be able to generate some kind of data file that could, for example, automate the creation of a Finale library file that positions glyph A and glyph B relative to each other. I don't know whether Finale's data format would allow that, but in principle, that's the sort of thing you could do. It's not a million miles out of the way of the sorts of things that we do in Smoofle, but it is a whole order of magnitude more sophisticated than the kinds of registration guidelines that we provide right now, because typically we haven't really needed to get more involved than the registration of two specific things relative to each other, like a note head to a stem or a clef to a staff line, or in one issue that we're looking at for 1.5, a tremolo slash versus the inside of a flag, this kind of thing. So it's certainly an order of magnitude more sophisticated than that, and I would suggest not something we would want to take on in Smoofle 1.5, but it probably is worthy of some more consideration and thought. With the caveat that it would need to end up being done in a sort of font technology agnostic way. So we'd need to come up with a way of describing these relationships. It would be quite a sophisticated and complex language of descriptions, I think, that we would need, but it could definitely be done. Whether it should be done, I don't know, but it's an interesting idea for us to ponder as we look beyond Smoofle 1.5.
Great.
So thank you for the idea.
Yeah, thanks for considering.
Yeah, and as part of that, what you would probably end up doing is looking to see what has been done for equation rendering for for math fonts. There's, because it's actually something, one of my clients I'm working on right now is specifically math fonts. And so there's kerning tables that are specific for math table, in the math tables for the font. And then either like Microsoft Word's equation layout pulls from that, Tech and LaTeX pull from that. And so they can figure out, okay, how can I best render the math equation? And that's, so Philip, one of the challenges is all the stuff that we've been seeing, other than the basic kerning we did for Norfolk and Hori, all of these other things are hacks around a system, right? They're saying, well, we know the rendering can't handle this, so we're going to create our own layout for doing, our own set of strings that define, okay, this is what I want for this kind of chord. I need to press this symbol 3 times, and ideally you want the rendering to handle a separate rendering layer to handle that, and then with a well-defined spec that says, okay, if you're a chord renderer, then here's the data you have that makes this look pretty.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And not to take really too much more time, but that's the issue. Like someone who is a font designer who is designing a Smoofle font music font can know that if the metadata is properly interpreted in the software, that their font will display the same in the different software programs. Obviously, the software program will control other things, not font related. But if they want to pair a chord symbol with a music font, then all bets are off at that point. And but like you said, the string, again, not to minimize the issue, it's kind of like if you're putting 3 P's in a row for pianissimo. Well, there's a alternative ligature that's used to kern those, and you're actually drawing a different glyph. But that's the oversimplification.
Yeah, but of course in Smoofle we don't define that as a ligature. We provide it as a separate glyph, and then
as a separate glyph. Yeah, right. Well, that's essentially, that's
and the only other thing I wanted to just add is that although it would be possible to create this kind of rich metadata format, font designers already find the production of the font specific metadata files with the fairly limited set of bits of data that are needed, such as anchor locations, cutout locations, and so on. They find that a little bit laborious and onerous, and so adding a really quite sophisticated set of data they would have to do, and probably the font applications, it's very easy to get things like, in the scheme of things, it's very easy to get things like anchors and cutouts out of a font program, but it's somewhat harder if you are defining these sort of 2D positions. And again, they can just be points, but it's much harder to then actually sort of test that in situ and then pull the data out in the same way. So anyway, these are all definitely things that we could think about. It's a big problem space, chord symbols. We could probably have a whole specification just for chord symbols, to try and come up with a taxonomy of all the different conventions, and then all the different types of symbols that could be used, and then how to position them all relative to each other in every situation. But so yeah,
That's why every program has done it differently so far, because everybody has their own ideas of how it should be done.
Indeed, and so does every musician, as far as I'm aware. So that presents a problem in its own right. Just if it's okay to move on a moment. One of the meeting participants, Klaus, sent me a message privately, but I think actually it's okay for me to answer it publicly. He asked me, sometimes when looking at SMOOFL issues, it's not clear whether an issue is with SMOOFL or with Bravura. And so if you have any doubt about that, where should you report the problem? Should you report the problem in the Bravura repository on GitHub, which is not, of course, Bravura is not a W3C thing, it's a Steinberg thing. Whether or not that's really correct, we possibly one day should figure that out. But right now, Bravura's stuff, which of course is about, the actual font itself, lives in a repository under the Steinberg Media organization on GitHub, whereas obviously the SMOOFL stuff lives under the W3C organization. I think that the simple rule is, if it's a visual problem with a symbol in the font itself, it should go in the Bravura repository. Pretty much anything else should go in the SMOOFL repository. And because I look at both of them, I'm quite happy to close issues in one and transfer them to the other if need be. But yeah, if you use that general rule of thumb that anything that's to do with a symbol in Bravura should go in the Bravura repository, and anything that's to do with what the font should actually contain or how, then that should go in the SMOOFL repository, and I will triage as required in either of those places. The most important thing, of course, is that you don't feel any doubts that you should report or request something. So just do that wherever in either of those places, and we will make sure that it gets to the right place. So unless there are any more,
I had one small
ahead.
SMOOFL question. You mentioned that we have translators for German, French, Spanish, Italian, Japanese. What about other languages? Because I'm thinking for Finale, we have very active Polish and Swedish localizers who might be interested in contributing. What's involved in spinning up new translation? It's free, right? So it's okay.
Yeah, I literally created just a standard set of languages, but we can add, Transifex is extremely flexible. We can add as many languages as we like. So certainly if there are people out there who are interested in working out what the Polish for particular symbols from the Dacian notation ought to be, for example, then have at it. We can just, if you go onto Transifex and sign up to join the team, then you can request which thing you basically have to identify which language you want to translate. I'm not sure what happens if you try to request a language that isn't already set up. It probably just sends us an email. So yeah, if anybody is welcome to do that. I think what we're hoping is that over the next little while, we'll see some contributors in different languages pop up and start doing some translation. If not, then we might need to see whether any of the companies that are, that are one way or another backing the projects that W3C are working on want to engage some of their professional translation support to help get some of these languages over the line. But it would be great to see if the community has done it. Sadly, we don't have any translations to contribute, for example, from Dorico. Otherwise, we would have contributed them already, because we just we left everything in English for the SMOOFL stuff. So we haven't done any of that localization ourselves. But this is why, for example, we've got some German strings, because MuseScore did translate some of it. So that's fantastic. But yes, if there are people out there who are interested in languages other than the 5 that I set up, yes, just request it on Transifex, and we will open it up to any
Great.
languages that people are interested in.
Thank you. And Mike Cuthbert pointed out that fortunately, Daisy notation is the same worldwide. so.
Indeed, bad example.
Okay, any other questions on Smoofle before I start resharing the presentation? Seems like not, so let me get back into sharing the presentation and move on to the instrument data.
That's right, this is me as well. So we spoke about this last year, and just in case you weren't here at our meeting last year, I'll just give a very quick summary of what the idea here is that we talked about last year. Obviously, one of the things that is kind of orthogonal to music notation, very closely related to it, but not strictly speaking, perhaps part of the notation itself, is how the capabilities of instruments themselves are encoded for use in software applications. And of course, this has an impact on notation, but it is not necessarily specifically itself actually a matter of notation. And all of the different music applications that have ever existed have to some degree or another decided to model this data in various ways, whether it's very simply from things like knowing that a flute should have a treble clef and a cello should have a bass clef by default, or down to, you know, what strings exist on a violin and what their pitches are typically and how they can be retuned for scordature and this kind of stuff. So lots of applications have lots of data that is, as it says here on the slide, not secret, because these are things that are part of real physical objects that exist in the real world. So it's hardly proprietary information what a standard guitar tuning normally is, for example. But it can be, given that, for example, Dorico alone has over 600 instruments in it, and I'm sure there are applications out there that have many more than 600 instruments defined, and that only covers really, you know, your bog standard Western orchestral instruments and a few other interesting ones, but it doesn't, for example, have anything to say about instruments from other cultures and geographies, or indeed historical periods, perhaps necessarily. So what would be fantastic would be to have and if you pop to the next slide, Michael, would be to have a standard way of representing this data that could be contributed to by many people, including experts who would know about different historical instruments or geographies or other cultural type information. And then that music software developers, in the same way they can take advantage of the capabilities of standards like Music XML and MNX and Smoofle, would also be able to take advantage of this structured data, you know, munging it into whatever format they actually want. So when we did our charter renewal or charter update earlier this year, we specifically accommodated the instrument data project as something that we as a group would be able to work on and could have as an active project. And we did also have some initial conversations with a few community group members about possibly having a leadership role in terms of managing this project. We didn't quite get as far as really starting as yet, and there are a lot of big questions to be answered in terms of, you know, what form the data is going to take, what data we're actually going to collect, etc., and try to represent. And where the project really sits is that somebody, and I had volunteered but have not yet done anything about it, somebody should really set up a list of use cases. I think just with MNX we were very driven by use cases when we started work on that specification all those years ago, and we really need to be use case driven again in any project to describe the capabilities of instruments or the characteristics of instruments. So we are not actively working on it, and for the immediate future I won't have any time to work on it because I'm going to be focused on Smoofle 1.5. But it is a project that we want to work on in the group, and you know, we spoke to a couple of members of the group, as I say, about it, and those people and any other people who are in the group who would be interested in playing a role in this project, please get in touch with us. It would be nice before this meeting next year to say that we have made some progress on this project. but we'll need some extra pairs of hands in order to make that happen. And I think if you're worried about the fact, oh, I don't know whether I would want to encode this in JSON or XML, how would I know how to decide that? Don't worry about those sorts of issues. Obviously by consensus we can decide on technology issues without too much trouble, and there's plenty of expertise and support around to manage those sorts of technical issues. But if you have an interest in the problem space and would be interested in helping to marshal the project, then that would be gratefully welcomed. Welcomely is not a word as far as I'm aware, but I've just coined it. So I think that's all there is to say on that, unless anybody has any questions about that project. We don't expect volunteers to step up now, by the way, but you're welcome to welcome, grateful. You're welcome to contact the co-chairs anytime. We're easy to find.
Any questions on the instrument data? Doesn't seem like it,
Go
so
on.
move on. I think, yes, this is me. And of course, I start when, once again, my the light is coming in funny on my room, but I'll try not to be too badly lit.
You're positively glowing, Michael.
What can I say? Music XML status. So Music XML 4.0, the latest version of the specification, was released in June of last year. Been implemented in several programs. And as we requested last meeting, we have been collecting suggestions for future versions on GitHub, a few documentation issues, a few issues regarding more semantic things, along with the backlog of issues that have been around for years that have not yet made it into a Music XML version. So we will keep on collecting issues for 4.1 and waiting until we get a critical mass of issues, most likely before doing work on that. So currently there is no immediate plans to work on a version 4.1, and our preference at the moment is to hold off on doing that until we get MNX 1.0 completed, or at least until having a full complete draft specification of MNX 1.0 to help focus the group on that. But those plans are subject to change because I'm retiring and somebody else is going to take over who may have totally different ideas and can drive things in different ways. So I will hand it back over to Daniel to discuss that, unless there are any immediate Music XML questions, given that scintillating update.
Short but sweet, I think, would be the way that we could describe it. Okay, so let's assume there are no Music XML questions. If there are any, they can return at the end of the meeting in the broader Q&A section. So yes, with Michael's decision to retire in a few months, and thank you, Michael, for giving us plenty of notice to let us know that what you were planning. We will be looking for both a new co-chair and a new Music XML specification editor to join Adrian and I in managing the specification going forward, and in fact having primary responsibility for the Music XML specification. We have already reached out to a few people in the community group, and we have been very gratified to have positive responses from several of them, and so that's wonderful. And we will be getting in touch with each of those people to have a chat between the four of us, basically Michael, Adrian, myself, and each of those people who've expressed an interest. But we want to make sure that anybody else within the community group who would like to be considered for that role should feel free to propose themselves by just getting in touch with any of the three of us. I've been the one who's been kind of leading the communication stuff, so in the first instance you're very welcome to email me. Just to say a little bit about what does it mean to be a co-chair of the group and a specification editor. So in terms of the co-chair stuff, well, we three co-chairs meet every 2 weeks roughly, and we have a scheduled meeting where we discuss the current issues that we're dealing with in each of the specifications, and we also deal with any broader stuff that needs to be dealt with, whether it's things to do with the charter, things to do with any of the W3C website stuff and publishing specifications, and dealing with the folks at W3C to coordinate things like the TPAC conference that we're a part of. So there is that standard bit of work that we do when we get together, and one of us writes the minutes, typically me, and we sort of talk about all those issues. Of course, the other thing is that you would be your opinions and your feedback on the specifications that are not your primary responsibility are also very, very much welcomed. We have, they don't always get minuted in great detail, but we spend a lot of the time in our co-chair meetings really getting into the nitty-gritty details of particular issues, especially with MNX, and it's been very helpful, of course, that Michael's got such a lot of expertise and experience with music encoding. But since Adrian and I have also, been quite involved in these sorts of things, we can have a good exchange of views on that. So that is a helpful attribute for any person who might be interested, that the willingness to engage with those sorts of design issues is really, really beneficial to make the specifications that we're working on as strong as they can possibly be. And then in terms of the duties of a specification editor, well, I mean, obviously you would be the person responsible for writing and producing the new version of the specification for Music XML. You would be responsible for the triaging and yak shaving of the GitHub issues. You would be responsible for determining the scope of future releases, and you'd be responsible for coordinating the work. I mean, obviously in the past, Michael has done the lion's share of the work on the Music XML specification implementation, because obviously he did the first half of Music XML's live completely on his own within either Recordare or within Make Music. But even in the last several years, he's still done the majority of the actual specification work. And so that would mean that, particularly for Music XML, you would need to know how to work with the tools and schemas and these sorts of things. And the other point I think that is specific to these, both Music XML, well, to all three of the formats, but it's especially important for Music XML, is that being able to test changes to the specification is also crucial. So probably having access to implementations that you can change might be quite beneficial. However, having said all that, as I say, we don't want to dissuade anybody who has the energy and the vision for what they would want to do with Music XML in the future, or how they would like to see it develop in the future. We don't want to dissuade anybody from letting us know and expressing their interest to us. So there is, we do want to sort of move on, because it's important to us that we try to get the new co-chair and spec editor in place by the time Michael is retiring in early January. So we do want to kind of get on and have these more detailed discussions with the possible successors in the very near future. So with all that said, if you would like to be considered as Music XML specification editor and co-chair of the group, then please let us know. Again, you can contact any of the three of us, but you might as well contact me by next Friday, September the 23rd, and we will then be delighted to hear from you, and we'll contact you to arrange a time that we can all get together and have a chat about it, and answer any questions that you might have, and ask you some questions ourselves. I think that just about covers it, Michael.
Any questions from folks on that before we move on?
Is it important that the new Music XML spec editor should also be a co-chair? Yeah, we think that it is. Yes, that's definitely our preference, because that we've had this sort of 3 co-chair structure ever since the group was created in 2015. Obviously, Joe was the original MNX spec editor and co-chair, and Adrian has more than ably stepped into Joe's shoes over the past several years. And we think that it's important that we have equal representation in the structure of the group for the formats that we're working on, which might even mean that in the future we could even add a further co-chair if the instrument data project gets off the ground, and the spec editor is somebody other than the three of us. But that, you know, that's not determined, but that might be the way that we choose to go. And having the three, you know, if two heads are better than one, then three heads are better than two. And as I say, one of the important roles that the co-chairs have is to contribute to the other specifications and the one that they are the specification editor for. And, you know, that I would say that probably the co-chair duties are, on the whole, much less onerous than the specification editor duties. I don't know whether Adrian and Michael would agree with that.
Agree.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
Agreed, yeah.
So if you're willing to be a spec editor, I would hope that you would also be willing to be a co-chair, so that you could participate in those other discussions. And of course, you know, apart from anything else, we would want the spec editor to be present at the co-chairs meetings, because that's the main point of coordination for the work on the three specs that we're working on presently. So even if you weren't the co-chair, you'd still be expected to attend the co-chairs meetings. So you might as well be a co-chair. Does that answer your question, Jim, or would you like to ask something else? I see you still have your hand up.
Follow-up question then. Let me push a little bit harder on the connection between co-chair and Music XML spec editor. It is possible to have another co-chair who is not the Music XML spec editor to get you three voices and three brains in the leadership conversation. And also I'm thinking about the trajectory of Music XML, the spec. If 4.0 is out and there's no plans for 4.1, and MNX might be able to get to 1.0 and take over the lead position, then looking at that trajectory, maybe what it says is that Music XML is more static and that the growing edge is MNX, in which case, what is the work of the Music XML editor at that point? It's to collect issues, but then maybe direct those issues off to MNX because that's where they would get handled. In which case, does that editor need to be in the top tier of group leadership?
I mean, I think so. Those are all excellent questions, and I think that, you know, as Michael already kind of intimated, the plan right now, given where the three of us who are currently working on these three standards feel about the future of Music XML, you know, I think that it's entirely possible there will be a future release in Music XML that adds some more features and so on, but we don't know what that would look like or when it would come. And as Michael already said, we certainly want to focus in the immediate term on driving MNX towards version 1, and indeed most of the issues that are remaining in the Music XML repository that Michael didn't tackle for Music XML 4, we pretty much agreed would be better tackled as part of MNX, and that probably will be true for at least some of the new issues that might arise. However, we cannot escape the fact that, as Michael already showed on his eye chart earlier in the presentation, there are more than 250 implementations of Music XML out there across a huge range of different types of applications, as Michael again alluded to. So it's quite possible that even maintaining Music XML in terms of improving documentation, in terms of tightening up, you know, just even yesterday there was an issue to do with you know, something we could document more clearly, for example, that we've discovered. So I think that there will still be work to do, even if, and it is an if, Music XML is more static in its development now than it has been in the past. You know, certainly we want to make sure that MNX has the best chance to succeed, and we want to put you know, our effort into driving that forward, because we do see MNX as the successor to Music XML. But Music XML is a mature, widely adopted and implemented standard, very rich, with a lot of complexity and sophistication, and it's quite possible that even if the spec editor is only clarifying points in documentation and so on, that could still be a decent amount of work for a little while yet.
So to take that and then give the counter argument to my own previous argument, even if Music XML is not the growing edge, it is still the load-bearing wall. And so what you want to do is look not at the moment when when MNX becomes the growing edge, but the moment when MNX is able to carry the burden that Music XML is carrying now. And that would be the point when Music XML maybe starts to step back from the top rank of the projects.
Yeah, indeed. And who knows exactly, you know, even though we plan to get MNX to version 1.0 as quickly as we can, that's really, as I was saying to the co-chairs in our meeting earlier this week, effectively that's the start line, because that's the point at which software applications will sensibly be able to start implementing MNX and really, you know, really kicking the tires and really making sure that it works as well as we believe it does. And, you know, so the medium-term future of Music XML is assured because, and in fact the long-term future is assured because there are hundreds of implementations of it in applications that are used by, I would guess, certainly hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of musicians are interacting with Music XML on a daily basis. So I think that it is really important for us as a group to recognize, as you say, the load-bearing nature of Music XML, not only on our group's work, but on the world of symbolic music representation and interchange and all these other sorts of things. And so I think it's very important that we have a successor who is able to manage it. And, you know, exactly what state that will take, you know, will depend on who we eventually select to join our little crew, and what their vision is, and what direction they want to go in, and how that, you know, fits in hand in glove with the things that we want to do in MNX and Smoofle, and potentially the instrument data as well. So, you know, the future is uncertain insofar as we don't know who will be leading Music XML or exactly what its future direction looks like. But it's certain in that we know as a group that we want to have a spec editor and co-chair who has responsibility for the standard, and somebody who is a capable steward of it in whatever its future direction turns out to be. Because it ain't going nowhere. So we want to make sure it's in good hands after Michael steps back.
Thank you for clarifying that. In particular, the clarification on the nature of Music XML and its importance as the load-bearing wall versus the growing edge is very helpful for me.
Great.
Any other
Good.
questions?
Any other questions? Oh, we're jinx, Michael.
I'll move on then to the.
So yes, we have not had an in-person meeting now, sadly, for a number of years. There's been the small matter of the coronavirus pandemic that has kept us from doing that. But what we're seeing as we emerge, if you can really truly say that we're emerging out the other side of the pandemic, is that the opportunities for in-person meetings are changing / diminishing. Obviously, Music Messe, which is one of the two places where we have historically had meetings here in Europe. Well, I say here in Europe because that's where I am. I know that's not where all of you are, but in Europe, is cancelled in perpetuity. So that one is off the table. NAMM obviously was a bit smaller this year and happened in June. I believe NAMM is happening in April next year. Maybe that will be a bit closer to the NAMMs of old. It remains to be seen. But as you can see from the little list of in-person events that we've identified here, TechChill is a sort of startup focused show in Latvia that Daniel Ray from MuseScore has proposed as a possible location, given that Latvia is relatively inexpensive and has a sort of good tech community, and that might be a place that we could consider going. The NAMM show, of course, in Anaheim is historically where we've had our North American meetings over the years, but not, I think, since 2019. 2020. I think I wasn't at the 2021, was I? That's the thing, but it did happen without me. As if anything could happen without me, but somehow it did. The Tenor Conference is one that's run for several years now. We've never had a meeting at the Tenor Conference, and it tends to alternate between a university in Europe and a university in the United States, or in North America at least, year by year. They haven't actually announced, I think, formally yet where they're going to be in 2023. But, you know, we could approach Tenor and asked them if they would be a host. The Music and Coding Initiative, MEI, they're having a joint MEI-TI conference next year in Paderborn, so we could consider there. There's also Music Austria, which is sort of maybe the closest thing in Europe to Music Messe, although it isn't happening until 2024. So there's no obvious thing there. And then we've also had the idea that possibly we might meet in an organization's offices. So, for example, we could meet in Hamburg at Steinberg's offices, or we could meet in Paris at IRCAM, who have offered to host a meeting. But the difficulty, of course, with having a meeting that we have independently of another event is that anybody who is going to attend is going to have to travel there, especially unless they happen to live in that city. And so, you know, that's tricky as well. So I wonder whether anybody in the group who's here today has any thoughts about this, any thoughts about whether, you know, how these online meetings work. I mean, obviously, I think the thing we miss from the in-person meetings is the chance to chat before and after the meeting, and of course the famous Garden Grove curry Thai meal that we have or have historically had at the NAMM show, which we obviously can't do on Zoom. I suppose we could all get Thai takeout, but it wouldn't really be quite the same. So yeah, what do people think? And does anybody have any other suggestions for possible events where a decent number of us might reasonably be able to attend, that could be locations for in-person meetings? And just the notion of in-person meetings, you know, how do people feel about them at this stage?
I realized after I put together the slide on this that we could also consider the W3C TPAC in person. That tends to alternate between Asia, North America, and Europe. And it also, the registration fee has been higher than what we've been used to at Music Messe or NAMM conferences. So there are a couple of drawbacks there, but it's another possibility to consider.
Yeah, that's a good point, Michael.
Music Notes regularly shows up at NAMM. That would be really easy for me to attend. But I mean, I'm willing to show up in person wherever. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I mean, trying to find where this group attends is probably a priority, but you know, because there's also the MLA Music Librarians Association conferences and other things like that for orchestrators and such. That at least gets if part of what we want is also to get connected to some of that community, that could be something to consider too.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jeff, because I mean, I suppose the tricky thing about MOLA in particular is that in general, the industry isn't really invited to that conference.
Right.
You know, the technology industry isn't really invited to that conference. Right. Obviously, some publishers go and all of the orchestras go, but it's not an ideal spot for the industry because they don't really want us there. Whisper it, but
yeah, no, I know. It's something that I keep wanting to go to myself, but
it's a great conference. I've been when it happened in London, I was lucky enough to go, and I have obviously attended also the one in Helsinki several years ago, which was great. But yeah, that sort of tends to be more of a special guest appearance. The industry isn't really normally invited.
Okay.
I wonder whether, you know, any of the other performing organizations, you know, I mean, here in the UK we've got the Musicians Union, the ISM, you know, and some of the companies that are in the industry are also members or sponsors or whatever of those sorts of organizations. And so, but they don't tend to have big shows. We used to have them in London. The Musicians Union used to have a thing called Music London, in fact, or Music Live London or something like that. But that hasn't run for several years, even pre-pandemic. And, you know, these sorts of in-person events have tended to just be dwindling with the rise of the internet, really, over the past decade or so, and the pandemic has just has killed a few of them stone dead, I think. And it's just going to be interesting to see whether or not anything new emerges to sort of rise up in place of them. So far, not much sign of it, but you know, it is still early days if we consider this to be the post-pandemic world, which I don't know whether we do or we don't really. Any other thoughts from anybody about this? Perhaps we could get a kind of show of thumbs up, thumbs down. Do these online meetings work for people? You know, just stick your thumbs up to the camera if they do, or thumbs down if you don't think they work at all. Yeah, so I think generally speaking, at least we feel like these meetings do work. Oh, excellent. We've actually got virtual thumbs as well. I didn't realize that. I don't use Zoom enough to know. It's all Teams for me, so I never get to use Zoom apart from in our co-chair meetings. Good. Well, so I mean that is something. And as a show of thumbs, virtual or otherwise, in principle, would you be able to travel to AN random place, let's say in North America, to attend a meeting? Would that be something that you could do if we could? Yeah, I don't know. I'm thumbs in the middle, really. It's difficult at the moment for me. Yeah, for Adrian too. What about if there was somewhere in Europe? Is there somewhere you could travel to? Those of us in Europe probably can say yes, that's a little easier than and those in the States can say no. Which is why, of course, we always met both in Europe and in North America.
And our Europe meeting was always considerably bigger. So I guess a question might be, how much could people travel to a site, something that is hosted by a site? Maybe that's something that happens on a Friday or Saturday or something. A music notation meetup suggestion from Mike.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, I mean, I think that is the thing, really. It's an excuse to where at least some of us would naturally want to be there anyway. I think that's because it can, particularly international travel, going thousands of miles just for a meeting that is not associated with anything else that you're doing can be difficult to get past, budget holders at companies and this sort of thing. I know that some of the people in this meeting are fortunate enough to be able to either be their own budget holder or at least know that they'll be able to say yes, but I'm not in that position. For example, I have to go cap in hand to ask to travel if there's somewhere I want to go. So, okay, well, I think, let's close this part of the meeting by saying that if anybody has any great ideas about places where, either shows or conferences or events or organizations or places where in-person meetups could be held, as I say, it could be at the offices of particular organizations or whatever it might be, or shows or trade shows or conferences, then just let us know, because we would certainly like to have in-person meetings again, if only so that we can get a Thai meal all together. But it would be, so just please keep your eyes and ears open and let us know in the co-chair group if there are any obvious opportunities that are arising. I think there's only one slide left, isn't there, Michael, which is the Q&A slide, which we almost don't need to go to, do we?
Well, let's see. Yep, it's the Q&A slide, so I can unshare. And then we have a couple of closing slides after this one. I will stop this. So are there any?
If you've got a question, please stick your hand up.
Or if you have answers.
That's right. Yeah, even better if you've got answers.
What about an event at Izmir? Good idea. I should have put Izmir on the slide.
You're right. We even talked about Izmir.
Where's Izmir?
About it earlier in the year. It moves around as well.
If anybody has access to a browser, because I have the slides on one and the Zoom on the other, so I can't check the browser now, but it moves around.
This year Izmir is in India, but they've been doing a lot of hybrid conferences.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think they've announced for 2023. Yes, we're welcoming bids for 2023, so we don't know where it's going to be next year. So,
but if it's been in it, then it's likely either in Europe or the United States.
Yeah.
Well, North America. So
that is one.
Actually, it might just be Americans. Yeah.
I've never had the pleasure of going to Izmir, but yes, that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, historically, I see China, France, Netherlands, Canada, and then online. So it looks like it hops around a lot.
Yep. That's the goal for them as an international society. So Mike has raised his hand. So Mike, if
Oh, Mike.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm over in Hawaii, so I was still a little groggy at the beginning of the meeting, so I might have missed if this came up in the first 15 minutes. But how has W3C been working as an umbrella organization for this group? I'm just asking because I know I'm at MIT when I'm not in Hawaii, and I know that there's been a lot of movement going on there with losing MIT as a hosting organization, and I'm just curious. Like I was 100% fully endorsing of the Music XML 4.0 spec, and I spent about I don't know, maybe 25 hours trying to figure out how I could vote my approval for it, and eventually gave up because there is nobody knows who my advisory representative is who can allow me to vote on anything, and so I'm just curious. I mean, you know, it seemed like an amazing choice at the beginning as the umbrella organization to get Finale and Dorico and Sibelius and Noteflight and everybody else together agreeing on one thing. But I'm just curious, has it proved like a useful organization for this group that's or less so?
I mean, I'll take that if I may. First, just to say, Sibelius aren't doing anything useful in this group. I want that on the record. And the but I think overall the answer is yes, absolutely yes. It is true that some of the voting infrastructure and the sort of mechanics of joining and leaving the group can be a bit wonky. But when we have run into problems with those things, we have been able to get assistance from staff at W3C who have helped to solve any of those problems that have come up. But I think bigger than any issues that might exist around things like the wonkiness of the voting system when we release a new version of a spec or what have you, is not only the infrastructure that they provide, so we have access to their GitHub organization and a lot of the tools and things that they provide, and we have the support again of the staff if we need it and so on, but also I think crucially it's the legal framework for the intellectual property rights and copyright that are really, really valuable, because by having the standards managed under the auspices of the CG, then anybody who signs up to the group and signs the CLA will be, their contributions are unencumbered in terms of, because the whole point is basically to make these standards free to implement. And W3C has all the experience in the world basically at managing those sorts of IP issues. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. It continues to make a lot of sense in my view for us to work under the auspices of the W3C because of, as I say, the ideals that the organization has in terms of the access to the work that is done as part of the group. They have, they do have very handy infrastructure and support for us if we need it. And it's an organization that is, intended to provide free access, even just to the tools of running the organization is free for us as well. So and obviously they're paying for it. Basically they're paying for the infrastructure of our blog and for our for our GitHub and all the rest of it. So so I think that we do benefit still greatly, and not that we have spent even a minute thinking about where an alternative organization could be that could host us, because I don't think it's really occurred to any of us in the co-chair group that that's something that we should consider. But I think I speak for Adrian and Michael when I say that we still find that the W3C is an excellent home for us, and any slight wonkiness that we might have in the infrastructure is more than made up for by the principles and the ideals and the practical nature of what being part of the W3C allows us. So
I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that if I could. I mean, basically agreeing with Daniel that W3C has been a fantastic home. It's been better than I imagined, because what I imagined was, well, geez, we're not paying anything, so what type of support are we going to get? But I've been at some of the W3C sessions during TPAC, and it's been very interesting to get the larger organizational perspective. The CEO gave a 10-year overview of how, W3C membership had declined and participation had declined when he came in 10 years ago. So a big drive was to increase the community, make the W3C the community where web standards happen, because they weren't working on anything new. It was all, perpetuation of the existing standards. It was very hard to get new things happening. So other community groups are serving as feeders for things that then become official W3C recommendations. I don't think we're really ever going to be in that type of role, given how complex our stuff. I can't imagine even when we get to MNX, I'm not sure I can really imagine, WebKit supporting MNX directly in the browser, although maybe that will happen at some point, at which case then the recommendation might be likely. But they've gone from having 1,500 developers in the community 10 years ago to 15,000 now. And community groups have been a large part of that. So the community is viewed as the asset, and thus we do get support when we, things, hey, I can't edit this thing. We updated our charter. Can we update our web page to, reflect the new charter instead of the one from 2015? Sure, that gets done in a day. So we get support for those types of issues. And regarding the sponsorship, it's been very interesting to hear about the move of the W3C from this consortium model to a legal entity. W3C's current organization, for those who don't know, is really kind of a weird thing. It's not really its own. There's no corporation. There's no entity. It's this consortium that is sponsored by 4 different organizations, including MIT. And this has had a lot of advantages, but it also has disadvantages and restrictions that are becoming more and more important over time. So the W3C seems to be on the verge of now becoming a separate legal entity, at which point Mike will be a member of an organization that's the same as any of us, so he should be able to vote. So moving to a legal entity should make it easier for Mike to vote. So I don't anticipate that organizational move to have any negative effect on the group. I think it'll make the W3C a stronger organization, and thus would be a beneficial thing for us. So even that change that's happening, I think is a good thing for us. Do we have any other questions?
I was just going to add one other thing, which
Sure.
is simply credibility. Just with the people involved in these specifications, we have credibility already for anyone in the notation industry, but newcomers to the music notation world, there's a value to being associated with the W3C, especially if you come from a web development background, because they have a good credibility in that world.
Going once, going twice for questions? Up, I see Jim has raised his hand.
I wanted to toss out the things that I would love to see. And I realized that if I mention this in this kind of community group, the immediate answer is, well, you go ahead and start working on it. One, infrastructure for a really seamless conversion between Music XML and MNX, but also with MEI. That I would like it to a future where it's very possible to move notation between those formats. And then secondly, a music notation diff tool, a comparison tool that will tell you whether scores are the same or different. Is there any obstacle to conducting that work under the auspices of this group?
I can take these. So my long-term vision for the MNX converter would be more of a Swiss Army knife that would include MEI, ABC, ideally any kind of music notation format that is documented. that would be really a net benefit to everybody in this community. So yeah.
So if I wanted to put my
one day at a
shoulder to
time.
that wheel, I could, that's the place to go.
Yeah, despite I mean, it's a bad name, MNX converter, for
Mhm.
more open-ended tool, but yeah, that would be my long-term vision.
Okay.
And sorry, what was the
Diff.
Notation
Oh,
diffing.
the diff tool. Yeah, once MNX is specified, at least at a 1.0 version, I'm really excited about experimenting with these sorts of meta tools and providing open source tools for making commonly needed modifications to a music notation document.
Mhm.
It's pretty abstract, but yeah, I would definitely include diffing as part of that. I don't know if that's necessarily something that our community group would produce directly, but on a personal level, I'm very interested in that. Also specifying a path into a piece of notation is something that would be generally useful in all sorts of applications.
Mhm.
And even notation editor commands like combine all the voices into chords, having that be a sort of an open piece of code that you can run on any MNX document, and maybe even can be integrated into notation editors in a free and open source way, is I think really interesting. So yeah, just to be clear, we're a ways away from that, but
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
definitely thinking about it and excited about it.
My interest is in making sure I know that this is the direction to go if I decide I want to lean heavily on that project, and B, seeing if the group has put walls in the way of it. And it sounds like the group is not putting walls in the way. Just needs the energy.
Yeah.
We'll welcome the energy when the energy arrives.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
And Jeremy had a question.
Oh, I just want to say I want to second what Adrian had said about some of the tooling around music notation, about being able to have equivalent of, bookmark or query into or transformation language that would be consistent. I see that, I personally view that as something that could be developed within the context of MNX. So I'm fully supportive of that. That's all.
You could even think of it as a plugin, like a standard for plugins for music notation software.
Exactly. I've had the experience of writing Sibelius plugins, and I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. And we know that the Finale plugins, with a change in Lua, there's also been something. It would be nice to have like write once, run everywhere.
Exactly.
Any other questions?
How far away do we think we actually are from V1? What else? I mean, we've got a list of things that complete at this point, as far as we can tell.
Yeah, it's hard to say. There's the scores versus parts stuff, mostly enharmonics. Then I think there's just a fair amount of busy work, dotting our I's and crossing our T's, getting articulations, all the stuff that is not controversial at all and doesn't really require design, quote unquote, but just needs to be done. So yeah, for me personally, it's also a matter of finding time. That's one of the reasons I would love to welcome more contributors. And thanks very much, Christina. You've been super helpful. So yeah.
There's some things I really care about, and there are some things I'm like, well, whatever they decide. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so sorry if that answer is wishy-washy, but I think that the list of big architectural decisions has dwindled significantly in the last year or so. And yeah, it's getting as close as it's ever been. But certainly
But-
Michael retiring, I think, is providing a good kick in the pants for getting things wrapped up to 1.0.
Okay, thanks.
And I see Mike's suggestion about the Roman text format being contributed to the group so there's a place for that spec to live. Kind of up to
It's just something that never dawned on me that there are these music notation micro formats that are used by small groups and things that I always thought that this group had to be about things as big as MNX and Music XML and Smoofle, but if you're encouraging this to be the place where instrument information might live and things, there's a number of small formats like that I think all the key players could agree that perhaps one community place to define where the next steps are could be great. And it could be, if it's something this group wants to take on, those micro formats, it probably that could be a place where you have a spec editor who doesn't need to be a co-chair, because it's a spec that only needs updating once every 7 years when somebody finds a little hole in something that already happened.
I see your name on the paper for that one, Mike.
I just created the first implementation that could actually read it and find all the bugs in the spec, because a computer software can figure out what's underdefined.
This is why it's important for the Music XML co-chair, I think, to be able to do an implementation, because I was always, the schema is one thing, but I was implementing it either in Finale or in Smart Music or in our Sibelius plugin. And usually with one of those three things, I have a rainbow halo. Oh, great. With one of those three things, you could figure out the bugs and the limitations in that. So I think having that a spec editor have access to at least one implementation is an important thing. Okay, I don't know how to move out of the halo.
You look like a J.J. Abrams movie, Michael. It's cool.
I have to see this on the video because I'm not seeing myself, and maybe I should move this over here. Oh, okie dokie.
Brilliantly arranged, Michael. Maybe you will disappear in a sea of glitter.
Maybe it's time we have 5 minutes left, so it's time to share the screen to do our concluding slides here. So this is the thing that if you are not already a member, because again, this was open through TPAC folks. So if we have W3C folks who are guests who are not already members, feel free to sign up. It's at our community group homepage, and that link will be shared in when we make the presentation shared. There, especially if English is not your primary language, it can be a little confusing. If you get confused, just contact the co-chair and we'll help you work through that. If you work for an organization that does music notation, please join as a representative of that organization. Or if you're at a university and your research is in music notation, please join as a representative of the organization. Technical work happens in our GitHub repositories for the most part. They're listed there. So if you want to follow what's happening, the best thing is to sign up for the GitHub repositories as well as the music notation community group. And if you make suggestions in GitHub, we need you to be members of the group. So you'll see me periodically poking people to join, and we've gotten a few members recently from that. We post our co-chair meeting minutes every on our blog. That usually happens after every 2 weeks or so. So there's lots of ways to be in touch with us. Do I have one more slide? No, that's it. So stop sharing. And we've made it with 4 minutes to spare. Any other last comments or question? If not, I'd just like to, or even if there is, I'd like to get this in before people go away. Just thank you to everybody for making this community such a strong place for the continued maintenance and development of all these great music notation standards. And thanks to Joe Berkovitz, who's not here, for really pushing hard on me to move the Music XML work to the W3C, because now it feels really, really good, that I can step away from this, and I'm confident that, I'll still be a member of the group, but I'm confident that the leadership of it will continue in a very strong direction. We have great participation from the members here, all the members of the different group who have participated over the years. It's been a lot of fun working for you, but it's time now for the next chapter that I will have. And part of the great fun of that is that I don't know what that's going to be. So I'm making space to discover what that is, but I'll certainly be commenting on things in the future with the community groups here. You won't be rid of me. Thanks very much to everybody.
Thank you to
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you,
Thank you
Michael.
very much.
Won't be the same without you leading the way, Michael. So thank you very much for everything you've contributed to not only this group but also to the broader field over the last 2 decades plus. We're pretty sure we wouldn't be here without you. So well done, and enjoy the whatever it is, as you say, that you discover, you decide you want to work on next. We will miss
Thank
you, but we know you won't be too far away, with your sage advice and your halo. So
Nobody else has anything. We'll wrap up the meeting. I will soon stop recording. We will, again, this gets recorded, and then there's an automatic transcript that happens on Zoom, which is pretty darn good. So it makes it a lot easier to get the closed captioning working. So once that is done, the video will be posted. We'll probably post the minutes and the presentation material ahead of that, and then link into the video later. But it should be coming out soon. Tom Neumann has asked Christina to say hi, since he couldn't make this particular meeting. Thanks for relaying those wishes from Tom.
we say hi back to Tom.
Yes. Okay. Thanks very much,
Yeah, he'll be
everybody.
glad to
for
hear
attending.
that.
Just hope so too, Christina. Great. Well, thanks very
Thanks.
much, everybody.
Oh, we should do the group photo. Sorry.
Oh, of course, the group photo.
Yeah, let me, is someone in a, let's get the gallery. I can stop recording this. So I'm going to stop recording.